Mr. Puddles. I'm a teacher's aide in a first-grade class outside Tacoma, Washington. I brought the kids out for recess on Friday afternoon. It had just rained. The old blacktop was covered in puddles. The kids loved it. They jumped from puddle to puddle, splashing around in their cheery yellow galoshes and rain slickers. 2 minutes in, Lily Yamagata tripped over Sophia David's backpack and skinned her knee. She was crying. I headed over to comfort her. I picked her up and brushed off the sand and grit. There was a hole in her tights and a little blood seeping from underneath. Nothing bad. Nothing she wouldn't forget about in 5 minutes. "You're okay, Lily," I announced, smiling. "Don't worry. The nurse will get you a nice Band-Aid. What's your favorite one?" Lily sniffled. "Steven Universe." "Perfect," I replied. "Hey, Sophia, why don't you hold Lily's hand and bring her to the nurse, okay?" "Okay, Miss Smith," Sophia agreed. She took Lily's hand and they trotted off. The nurse's office was right around the corner from the school's entrance. I could watch them the whole way. Kids whooped and giggled behind me while I made sure the girls got where they were supposed to go. "Mr. Puddles!" Someone yelled, and a few boys shouted in mock fear. It took a second, but I recognized the voice. Caden Watabe, a pain in my ass. There was a loud splash, followed by more shouts. "Caden," I admonished, as the girls opened the front door and rounded the corner. "Don't splash other people." "But Mr. Puddles is going to get them!" Caden roared and splashed again. The nearby kids scattered to avoid the water droplets. The girls had reached the nurse's office. I could see them through the front window. I turned around and confronted Caden. "Caden, Miss Murgowski and I have talked to you about this." He hung his head. "I know." "What did we say?" "Don't splash people who don't want to be splashed." "Right. And what were you doing?" "Splashing." He paused. "But I was trying to make sure Mr. Puddles didn't come." I grinned. Despite his obstreperous streak, Caden's always been creative. I loved reading what he wrote, and his pictures were always remarkable. Dark, but remarkable. He reminded me of how I'd been at his age. I squatted down and put my hands on his shoulders. "Look, just do me a favor and don't splash your friends. If you're good, I won't say anything to Miss Murgowski, okay?" Behind him, a group of 3 boys were huddled around the big puddle Caden had been messing around in. They weren't laughing or bouncing through it. The water was still. The boys were motionless and unsmiling. That wasn't a good sign. Caden answered, but I wasn't paying attention to him. I straightened up and called out, "You guys okay?" Something shimmered on the surface of the puddle. One of the boys whimpered. Caden whirled around and gasped, then ran toward them. "Get away from them, Mr. Puddles!" he shouted, then leapt for the center of the water. "Kate!" I started, but it was too late. He flew clumsily through the air and landed. Dark red fluid exploded from the puddle. 3 boys were struck by the spray. They began to scream with uncomprehending terror. I shrieked and ran toward them. Caden's clothes lay in a wet heap. "Caden!" I shouted. I picked the drenched raincoat and clothes out of the sickeningly warm puddle and felt around. It was only about 3 inches deep. He wasn't there. The screams of the children got the attention of other adults in the school, and someone called 911. I mindlessly fumbled around in the puddle until someone pulled me away. I was questioned by the police, then released. Search teams have been looking for Caden all weekend. The school is closed today. I don't know what to do. My blood-stained clothes are still sitting on the floor of my bathtub. I can't deal with the thought of touching them again. It's not just the thought of Caden's blood that horrifies me. It's not just the intrusive thoughts I keep having about how I could have saved him. It's what I saw as the policeman brought me home after it all happened. It's the puddle I glanced at while the police car drove by the blacktop where the kids had been playing. The puddle that was glassy and unmoving, despite the heavy rain that had picked up not long after Caden's accident. The puddle that, no matter how hard I blinked my eyes and shook my head to clear what had to be an optical illusion, had the reflection of a pale, wide-eyed, laughing face, Mr. Puddles. We are all smiling. The overly wide, grinning mouth is a horror cliché. It's a trope, albeit a successful one, that's wormed its way into scary stories from around the world. So ubiquitous is its inclusion that it's taken on a legendary status. It feels like something that's always been around to scare people, right? In 1844, one of the first serial killers in Connecticut began a rampage. Little was known about the killer, save for their signature technique of disfiguration. While the victims were alive, they amputated their cheeks. When the bodies were eventually found, their toothy, skeletal smiles became fodder for nightmares, rumors, and legends. The killer was never captured. Starting in 2012, local Connecticut message boards and forums started to feature messages and questions about ghosts. There's a town in Connecticut called Monroe. It is infested with hauntings. 2 cemeteries, Union and Stephanie, are sites where ghosts can be found wandering between headstones and sometimes out in the road. In November 2012, there was an enormous uptick in the number of sightings, which precipitated the message board posts. Those who saw the ghosts began having nightmares. Those who read about the ghosts began having nightmares. The nightmares themselves were unique, save for one shared feature. They ended with the dreamer thinking they woke up, then seeing a white, ghostly woman with devastating facial disfigurements crouching on their chests. She'll stare at them and trace her fingertips across their faces as she grins with her hideous, wide smile. It's not unusual for cultural events to shape the content of dreams. Following the release of the movie The Exorcist, it was widely reported that people were having dreams about demonic possession. These reports of the ghostly women are likely tied to the prevalence of the scary stories I mentioned above, along with the sightings of so-called ghosts. I believed that for a little while. Then I started having the dreams. My kids and wife did too. Each night, I'd watch, paralyzed, as the woman sat on my chest and touched my face. I'd wake from the nightmare sweating and experiencing pain in my cheeks and chin. Soon after, the kids would start to scream. Online searches for the identity of the 19th century serial killer have gone through the roof over the years. According to Google's list of trends, other trends have started to show up too. Facial pain, difficulty swallowing, facial eczema. Maybe it's just my own paranoia, which I admit is growing by the day, but I can swear people around here are smiling more often. They're joyless smiles, but smiles nonetheless. My wife, whose stern, no-nonsense expression is legendary at the school where she teaches, now has smile lines creasing the corners of her mouth, and they're turning redder as the days, weeks, and months go by. My kids have always been relatively cheerful, even when they're bored or tired. You can still see a spark of positivity in their eyes. That spark is gone, but their smiles are as wide as ever. Wider, maybe. The local Connecticut message boards are buzzing about a find someone made regarding the serial killer from 1844. Apparently, there was a chest from a Monroe church that had been given to the Historical Society in the 1980s. It was never opened and remained in the Historical Society basement for 30 years. The other day, on a whim, someone opened it. Contained within were the musings of an old nun. Musings on positivity, on happiness, on smiles, and there were drawings of people with impossibly wide grins. A knife was found, wrapped in cloth, tucked into the corner of the chest. This morning, before dawn, I had the dream again. She was on me. For the first time, I noticed the heavy cross around her neck. She caressed my face like she'd always done. But this time, her fingernails began to scrape and scratch against my skin. It tickled, then it hurt. It hurt very badly. I tried to struggle, but I couldn't wake up. I couldn't get her off. The sound of a blood-curdling scream exploded through my dream, and I woke up. The woman disappeared. I looked at my wife in bed next to me. She was screaming as she slept. I watched as the corners of her mouth split, and with a sickening crunch, I heard her jaw dislocate. Blood poured down on the sheets as I grabbed her and tried to pull her out of bed and back into the waking world. Down the hall, I heard my kid shriek with pain. A half-hour later, we arrived at the hospital. It was full of people bleeding from wounds on their cheeks. Some were worse than others. The place was overwhelmed, and I don't know what to do. Even as we bleed, we are all smiling. The Little Ghost. When the little ghost first started coming to me, he whispered nice things that made me feel good.
You have pretty hands. I love how you do your nails. How did you get your skin to be so smooth?
He stayed with me all day and all night. As the days went by, though, I must have done something to make the ghost angry. Instead of mawkish pleasantries, the messages grew negative.
I've seen other girls with prettier hands. What happened to your nails? I'm sorry your skin looks so dry nowadays.
I started to get upset. I'd grown fond of the little ghost, since he'd always been so positive. It was comforting. But once he started to get mean, I wondered what I'd done wrong. I didn't want my little ghost to feel like I'd disappointed him. One night, as I was getting ready for bed, I saw the ghost in the mirror. He looked up at me as I brushed my teeth and said, with sadness in his voice,
Your cuticles are so ragged and ugly.
I looked down at my hands. He was right. I hadn't been taking care of them at all since I started that art class. Bits of skin and hangnails sprouted from each cuticle. They were red and angry.
Can you get rid of them for me?
The ghost sounded so hopeful. I couldn't bear to make him feel like I wasn't the good person he initially believed me to be. What if he left? I grabbed the corner of a thick hangnail on the side of my left middle finger. I started to pull backward. It hurt terribly. The ghost, his eyes brimming with hope, told me I was doing such a great job, even through the pain of what I was doing. I was overwhelmed by relief. I was finally doing something right. I kept working on the hangnail. After a little while, I'd pulled a thin strip from the side of my finger, up to my hand and across my arm to the inside of my elbow. It stung terribly, but as tears of joy flooded from the ghost's eyes, I started to wonder if things were getting back to normal.
Your hand is looking a tiny bit better,
the ghost informed me.
Maybe someday you can be pretty again.
I spent the next hour tearing the skin and nails from my fingers, even though they bled and I thought they looked terrible. The ghost smiled and assured me I had the hands of a beautiful angel. Through my tears, I smiled. As the days went by, I did what I could to make the ghost happy. Sometimes he'd get in a bad mood. Just the other night, he told me the skin on my lips was ugly and chapped. I pulled the chapped skin away. Some of it went pretty far up my cheeks before it tore, but it was okay. The ghost talked on and on about how kissable I'd become. My parents arrived at my apartment this morning. They hadn't said they were coming, but it was a nice surprise. It had been a while, but when they saw my face and my hands, they were horrified. My mom sobbed. "What happened to your beautiful face?" she said. My dad, almost at the same time, exclaimed, "Oh my God, your hands are ruined." Tears started to leak from my eyes. Off in the corner, my ghost sighed.
They're the ones who make us so sad, aren't they?
I agreed. 10 minutes later, as I worked to saw their bodies into small parts, I asked the ghost if he'd be happier now that they weren't around. No answer. I turned around to see if he was listening. The little ghost was gone. My cellar door is breathing. We'd been finding paint chips and broken bits of plaster on the carpet near the cellar door. I'd vacuum them up, but each morning they'd be back. At first, I thought it had to be from mice or termites burrowing into the wall. We've had mice in the basement since we moved in, but they'd never been seen anywhere else in the house. Despite that, I looked for evidence that they could have made the mess, but I couldn't find any. There wasn't anything out of the sort whatsoever, aside from what we'd find in the mornings. Larry didn't think much of it. He'd mentioned something about a construction site a mile or so away where they'd been blasting out rock. Apparently the shock waves they produce can form cracks on walls and ceilings. Just cosmetic issues, he assured me, nothing structural. But neither of us could remember hearing any blasting, especially in the middle of the night. My guess was whatever had been making our cellar warmer than usual over the last few weeks was to be blamed. Neither Larry nor I could figure out why that was happening either, but we both assumed there was something to do with the furnace. The HVAC technician couldn't find anything wrong, but even he admitted that it was strange the basement was a full 30 degrees warmer than the temperature set on the thermostat. So, with the working belief that the paint and plaster chips were from the expansion and contraction of the doorway, we went on caring about more important things and hoped the heat issue would fix itself. Last week, I was getting home after a red-eye flight back from my sister's. Larry was dead asleep when I walked in the house at 4:30 a.m., and I was so sleep-deprived I couldn't believe I hadn't killed myself driving home. After I put my stuff down and was getting ready to head upstairs, I saw something that, at the time, I was certain was a result of my exhaustion. The cellar door and the surrounding frame were moving in and out. I shook my head to get my senses back, but the door frame still moved in a slow, deliberate pattern. Tiny flecks of plaster fell with each contraction. I walked up to the door and put my hand on it. I still wasn't trusting my eyes, and I knew that touch would confirm or deny what I was seeing. As I expected, the second I touched the door, the movement stopped. I went upstairs and slept for 10 hours. Larry was at work when I woke up. He was pulling a double that day, and I likely wouldn't see him again until the next morning. After I showered and went downstairs, I found quite a bit more plaster and paint on the floor than usual. The memory of what I thought I'd seen the night before came back, and I experienced an involuntary twinge of fear. It made me feel a bit silly, almost like how I'd felt when I was a little girl and still afraid of the dark. I brought out the vacuum and started to clean up the mess. When I was running the vacuum over the carpet right next to the cellar, I felt hot air rushing out of the cracks on the sides and bottom of the door. Not warm, hot. I shut off the vacuum and listened. Aside from the gentle rush of hot air, there was nothing. I tentatively touched the doorknob, ready to pull back if it was too hot. It wasn't. It was very warm, but not hot. The fear came again as I knew I was about to open the door and go downstairs. I didn't want to. The child in me wouldn't have, but I'm 52 years old. This is our house, and we've lived here for 26 years. We know it inside and out. There was nothing to be afraid of. The fear remained. I opened the door and was hit in the face with a rush of hot, wet air. While the temperature wasn't unendurable, it was entirely unpleasant. My plan was to rush downstairs to make sure nothing was on fire, then run back up and call the HVAC man for an emergency visit, no matter the cost. I tiptoed down the old, wooden steps and entered the basement. The wind rushing up the stairs faded as I got closer to the bottom. All that remained was humid, oppressive air. I began sweating immediately, and I walked across the room toward the furnace. It wasn't even on. I touched it, and while warm, it wasn't close to the temperature of the room. Condensation was covering the tiny windows at the top of the walls, and there was an odor. It was heavy and thick and reminded me of vomit. I felt my stomach churning as my mission now became finding the source of the smell. Whatever it was, it had to go. It didn't take long. On the other side of the furnace, up against the wall, was a pile of dead mice. Tens of them, maybe 50. They were hideously decayed and dripping with dark yellow slime. I gagged so hard I felt my eyes bulge, and I pulled my shirt over my nose and mouth. I couldn't believe we hadn't noticed them before, and I was miserable about the prospect of cleaning them up. But it had to be done. I ran upstairs, grabbed a bucket, some kitchen gloves, and a bottle of bleach. Back in the stifling basement, I grabbed the vermin as quickly as I could, threw them all in the bucket, threw the gloves on top, and poured bleach over the whole area. I'd come back later and scrub the remaining slime and bleach and slowed fur off the floor. I just couldn't take any more at the moment. I grabbed the bucket and headed back upstairs. I could have sworn I saw the cellar doorway widening and narrowing as I went, accompanied by waxing and waning gusts of hot air on my skin. My fear and disgust were bordering on terror as I burst through the doorway into the cheery living room. I stood in the center of the living room, watching the doorway. It wasn't moving. The bucket of dead vermin smelled incomprehensibly putrid. I went out the back door and was ready to throw the whole thing way out back where the property met the woods, when I stopped. There was smoke coming from the gloves on top of the mice. Another smell joined that of the putrefying rodents. Burning rubber. I appended the bucket into the brush. I saw that the parts of the gloves that had touched the mice were bubbling and burning away. As soon as I got back inside, I called the HVAC guy. He said he was booked solid all day and any work after 6 p.m. would be at double the usual rate. I told him I didn't care. I needed the furnace fixed. I needed whatever it was leaking removed. I couldn't have our home in the shape it was in anymore. The HVAC guy arrived around 7. I felt bad to be pulling him away from dinner with his family, so I made him a sandwich and some macaroni and cheese. He appreciated it and brought a plate downstairs with him so he could eat while he worked. I wasn't exactly sure how anyone could eat under conditions like I'd seen that afternoon, but I didn't bother arguing. I left him to his work and went next door to see my elderly neighbor. We got talking, and it was almost 10 by the time I realized the HVAC technician was still working. I wished Gladys a good night and went home. The tech's van was still in the driveway. I walked inside and headed to the cellar door. Plaster and dried paint chips littered the carpet and were being blown across the room by the steady breeze coming up the staircase. 3 deep cracks in the door frame and ceiling had appeared. I called down to the technician and asked how it was going. He didn't reply. I called again, louder. Nothing. The same fear welled up in me again. I looked around. This time, the cheery living room was dark. The windows showed nothing but blackness and the distorted reflection of diffused kitchen light in the harsh illumination of the tech lamps in the basement. I called a third time. He didn't respond. But I jumped when a loud, splintering crack rang out next to me as another fissure appeared in the door. I could have sworn I saw the frame move right before it happened. My fourth and final call went unanswered. For the second time that day, I knew I'd go down the stairs. My 52-year-old body carried my frightened 8-year-old mind down the steps. I felt hot, sticky air on my face. I reached the furnace and headed around the other side. The smell was so strong, my eyes had started to water. But even through my bleary, tear-filled eyes, I could see the technician's clothes and shoes. They were covered in the same yellow slime and smoked weakly as whatever was burning them ate its way through. The man who owned the clothes was nowhere to be found. I ran upstairs and called the police, fully aware that the doorway was moving in and out as I ascended the staircase. Feeling cool air against my face, followed by hot air against my back, I left the house and waited with Gladys for them to arrive. It's been 5 days, and the technician has not been recovered. There's been a town-wide search for him, and his wife and daughters have appeared on television begging for him to come home. Larry and I have allowed the police to search the house while we stay at a hotel. I've refused to go back until everything is resolved. It wasn't the terrifying strangeness of the cellar that has kept me out of our house. It wasn't the still-missing man who came to fix our furnace. It was something else. It was the result of the chemical analysis of the substance on the HVAC man's clothes and the mice I'd taken from the basement. Normally, we wouldn't have been given that information, but Larry's brother is a cop. He told us what it was, and now I know I'll never set foot in that house again, as long as I live. Stomach acid.